The Vethkai Dominion had ruled the stars for 10,000 years. And in all that time, they had never once questioned their place at the top of the galactic food chain. They were conquerors by nature and slavers by tradition. And their method of expansion was simple and brutal. Find a weak colony, crush it with overwhelming force, and drag the survivors back to serve the Dominion's endless hunger for labor. High Arbiter Zethral stood on the command deck of his flagship and watched the blue-green world spinning slowly beneath him. And he felt the familiar thrill of conquest building in his chest. Elysium 7 was a human agricultural colony, home to just over 2 million souls who had come to this distant world, seeking peace and prosperity among the wheat, fields and orchards they had planted in alien soil. They had built domed cities and terraforming stations and schools where their children learned about Earth, a homeworld most of them would never see. They believed they were safe out here at the edge of explored space, 3 weeks away from the nearest Terran military outpost. They were wrong. Zethral gave the order, and his fleet descended upon the colony like wolves upon a sleeping village. The first wave of orbital strikes took out the communication arrays, cutting Elysium 7 off from the rest of human space before they could even send the distress signal. The second wave shattered the modest defense grid, turning the handful of patrol ships and ground-based weapons into expanding clouds of debris by the time the shock troops began their descent in armored dropships. The colonists had nowhere to run and no one to call for help. The invasion of New Helsinki, the colony's largest city, took less than 4 hours. Vethkai soldiers marched through streets lined with human homes and human shops and human schools, and they rounded up everyone they found with the efficiency of long practice. Families were separated without mercy or hesitation. Children were tagged with neural markers and loaded onto transport ships bound for integration facilities, where they would be conditioned to forget their parents and their culture and their very humanity. The elderly and the sick were deemed unproductive, and they were taken to processing centers, where their biological components would be harvested for the Dominion's use. Everyone else received a neural compliance collar, a device that clamped around the neck and sent threads of control deep into the brain, ensuring perfect obedience through the simple mechanism of overwhelming pain for any act of defiance. By dawn on the second day, Elysium 7 belonged to the Vethkai Dominion. Zethral walked through the conquered streets of New Helsinki and felt nothing but satisfaction at a job well done, because this was what his people did and what they had always done. He paused to watch a group of human workers being marched toward a labor transport, their eyes empty and their spirits broken. And he wondered briefly if humanity would prove useful enough to justify the conquest. They were a young species by galactic standards, barely 5 centuries into their interstellar age, and they had spread across a modest territory with the eager energy of children discovering a new playground. The Galactic Concord had accepted them as members, and the other great powers had traded with them and signed treaties with them and generally treated them as harmless newcomers who posed no threat to anyone. The Vethkai had noticed something different about the humans, a certain quiet watchfulness behind their friendly smiles. But Zethral had dismissed it as the natural wariness of a young species. Surrounded by ancient powers, now he dismissed it entirely, because the humans of Elysium 7 had proven just as easy to conquer as any other prey. He returned to his flagship and composed a standard declaration of conquest, a formal announcement to the Galactic Concord that the Vethkai Dominion had claimed new territory and new subjects. The message was transmitted on all diplomatic frequencies, and Zethral settled back in his command chair to wait for the response he knew would come. He expected outrage. From the human government on Earth, he expected threats and demands, and perhaps a desperate rescue attempt that he could crush publicly to demonstrate The futility of resistance. He expected exactly what he had received from every other species the Dominion had conquered. Noise and fury that would eventually fade into reluctant acceptance. What he received instead was silence. Hours passed, and the communication officers reported nothing from Earth, nothing from the Terran United Colonies, nothing from any human frequency, anywhere in explored space. Zethral ordered them to scan every band and every wavelength, certain that the humans were simply slow to respond or that their message had been lost in transit. More hours passed, and still there was nothing. The other powers of the Galactic Concord were chattering nervously on their own channels, waiting to see how humanity would react to this humiliation. But the humans themselves remained completely and utterly silent. Days went by, and the silence continued. Zethral began to feel a small knot of unease forming in his stomach. Though he told himself it was simply impatience. He had conquered dozens of species over his long career, and he knew that some took longer than others to process their grief and their rage. But this felt different somehow. This silence was not the stunned quiet of a defeated enemy or the sullen acceptance of a broken people. This silence felt deliberate, purposeful, like the held breath before a scream. A week after the conquest, one of Zethral's junior officers approached him with a report that made the unease in his stomach grow stronger. Human merchant ships had vanished from the major trade routes. Human embassies across the Concord were being quietly evacuated. Human military patrols had ceased along their borders, and observation satellites were detecting massive movements of ships and resources toward the core of human space. When Zethral demanded to know what this meant, his analysts offered theories and speculation, but no real answers. Some believed the humans were consolidating their forces for a counterattack. Others thought they were simply hiding, too afraid of the Dominion's power to risk open confrontation. But the oldest advisor in Zethral's court, a veteran of campaigns against dozens of species, offered a third interpretation. He said the word quietly, almost reluctantly, as if speaking it aloud might make it true. He said the humans were preparing. When Zethral asked what they might be preparing for, the old advisor had no answer, and he requested permission to retire to his estates far from the front lines. Zethral denied the request and returned to watching the empty communication channels, and he tried very hard to ignore the cold feeling that had settled into his bones. The galaxy held its breath and waited for humanity to speak, but the silence continued, and with each passing day it grew heavier and more terrible, until even the mightiest powers in the Concord began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake in dismissing the humans as harmless newcomers. Something was coming, something that the silence was hiding and preparing, and no one in the galaxy knew what it was. No one except the humans themselves, and they were not talking. Ambassador Kethvora of the Rethani Collective had served in the great diplomatic halls of the Galactic Concord for nearly 300 years. And in all that time, she had never seen anything quite like what was happening now. The Terran delegation's seats sat empty in the Grand Assembly Chamber, and they had been empty for 2 weeks. The human embassy on Concordia Station had been completely evacuated 3 days after the Vethkai invasion of Elysium 7, and the speed and thoroughness of that evacuation had unsettled everyone who witnessed it. The human staff had not fled in panic or left in anger. They had simply packed up everything they owned and departed in calm and orderly silence, taking with them every document, every piece of furniture, and even the potted earth ferns that had decorated their lobby for decades. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment, as if they had always known it would come and had planned exactly how they would respond. Kethvora tried to contact their counterparts in the Terran diplomatic corps, people she had known and worked with for over a century, but her messages went unanswered and her calls were routed to Automated systems that offered no information and no hope of connection. She was not the only one experiencing this sudden and total disconnection from humanity. Trade ships across the galaxy were reporting the same strange phenomenon. Human merchant vessels had vanished from the major transit lanes, and the reliable flow of goods that had connected human space to the rest of the Concord had simply stopped commerce. Contracts that had been in place for generations were being terminated with polite but firm messages that offered no explanation and no timeline for resumption. Manufacturing agreements dissolved overnight, leaving factories across a dozen star systems without the specialized components that only human engineers knew how to make. When the Rathani Collective attempted to contact their human trading partners about a scheduled antimatter shipment worth billions of credits, they received only a short automated response: all external operations suspended, duration indefinite. The Concord's economists began to panic as they calculated the impact of humanity's sudden withdrawal from galactic commerce. The humans had made themselves useful over the centuries, integrating their economy with dozens of other species in ways that now seemed less like partnership and more like dependency. No one had realized how much they relied on human goods and human services until those things suddenly vanished. But the economic disruption was nothing compared to the political uncertainty that gripped the great powers of the galaxy. Everyone was waiting to see what humanity would do. And humanity was doing nothing, saying nothing, revealing nothing on the conquered world of Elysium 7. High Arbiter Zethral received reports from his overseers that made him uneasy in ways he could not quite explain. The enslaved humans were working with perfect compliance, their neural collars ensuring obedience to every command. And yet something about their behavior was deeply strange. They never spoke to each other. Not a whisper passed between them, not a glance of shared suffering, not even the small gestures of comfort that enslaved populations usually exchanged when their masters were not watching. They moved through their assigned tasks in total and absolute silence, their faces blank and their eyes fixed on whatever work was placed before them. The overseers reported that the humans worked efficiently and without complaint, but they also reported feeling watched, feeling studied, as if the silent workers were observing everything around them with a patience that bordered on predatory. Zethral dismissed these reports as the nervous imaginings of soldiers who had never faced a truly dangerous enemy. But he ordered increased security measures all the same. He was beginning to understand that something about this conquest was very different from all the others. Though he still could not say what his spy masters brought him intelligence from across human space. And none of it made sense. Terran border systems had gone completely dark. Their defense stations powered down, and their patrol routes abandoned. Observation satellites that had monitored human territory for centuries were now detecting massive movements of ships and resources, all of them flowing toward the core systems of human civilization in patterns that defied military logic. The humans were not reinforcing their borders or preparing defensive positions. They were pulling everything inward, concentrating their forces in ways that left their outer colonies completely exposed. Some of Zethral's advisors argued that this proved humanity was weak and afraid, that they were abandoning their frontier worlds rather than risk confrontation with the Dominion. Others suggested that humans were consolidating their strength before launching a counterattack, though no one could explain why they would surrender so much territory in the process. Only the old veteran advisor offered a different interpretation, and his words stayed with Zethral long after the briefing ended. He said the humans were not retreating and they were not consolidating. They were transforming. He said the galaxy had only ever seen what humanity wanted it to see: a friendly and cooperative species that posed no threat to the established order. And now that mask was coming off. He said the silence was not fear or hesitation. It was focus, the absolute concentration of a predator preparing to strike. Zethral demanded to know what evidence supported such a dramatic claim. And the old advisor admitted he had none. He had only instinct. The same instinct that had kept him alive through 100 campaigns. Against 100 different enemies, that instinct was screaming at him now, telling him that the Dominion had made a terrible mistake, that they had awakened something that should have been left sleeping when he finished speaking. The room was quiet for a long time. Zethral stared at the holographic display showing the strange movements of human ships, and he felt the cold unease in his stomach grow colder still. 3 weeks had passed since the conquest of Elysium 7, and humanity had not said a single word. The entire galaxy was watching and waiting and wondering. But the humans offered nothing. No threats, no demands, no explanations, no anger, no grief, just silence, and with each passing day, that silence grew heavier and more terrible. Pressing down on the Vethkai Dominion like the weight of a gathering storm, something was coming. Something the silence was hiding, and Zethral was no longer certain he wanted to know what it was. The weight of history ambassador Kethvora of the Rithani Collective was old enough to remember the first human ship that had stumbled into collective space. More than 4 centuries ago, when humanity was still young and uncertain and full of wonder at the vast galaxy they had discovered. She had been a junior attached back then, barely old enough to serve in the diplomatic corps, and she remembered laughing with her colleagues at the primitive vessel with its chemical rockets and its clumsy navigation systems. She remembered looking at the human crew with their short lifespans and their fragile bodies and thinking how harmless they seemed, how eager to please, how desperate to find their place among the ancient powers of the galaxy. She was not laughing now. It had taken 6 weeks of calling in every favor she had ever earned and activating every back-channel contact she had ever cultivated. But she had finally managed to secure a meeting with a human representative. The response to her desperate requests had been brief and unsigned. A set of coordinates at the edge of neutral space, a specific time, and a single instruction that told her to come alone. Kethvora considered bringing guards anyway, considered refusing the terms and demanding a proper diplomatic summit. But something in her gut told her that this was the only chance she would get. She flew to the coordinates in a small personal shuttle and found a single human ship waiting for her, a vessel of unfamiliar design that her sensors could barely detect even at close range. The human who met her in the ship's sparse conference room wore no uniform and bore no official title. She was a woman of middle years by human standards, with gray streaking through her dark hair and lines of age around her eyes. And there was something in those eyes that made Kethvora's secondary hearts beat faster. This woman had seen things and done things that ordinary humans never knew about, and the weight of that knowledge sat on her shoulders like armor. "You want to know what we are doing," the woman said. And it was not a question. Kethvora chose her words with great care, because she understood somehow that everything depended on this conversation going well. "The Concord is concerned," she said, "and the markets are in chaos, and species across the galaxy are frightened by your silence." "Frightened of us," the woman replied. "Or frightened of what we might do." Kethvora thought about lying, but decided the truth would serve her better. "Is there a difference?" she asked. The human smiled, and there was no warmth in it, no friendliness. Nothing but the cold calculation of someone who had been playing a very long game and was finally ready to reveal her hand. "Your people have known us for 400 years, the woman said, leaning back in her chair and studying Kethvora with eyes that seemed to see right through her. "You have watched us spread across the stars, watched us build colonies and establish trade routes and integrate ourselves into your galactic society. And in all that time, have you ever stopped to wonder why we were so eager to be seen as manageable? Kethvora felt something cold settle into her chest. Something that might have been fear, or might have been the dawning of understanding. We are a young species by your standards, the woman continued. Barely a few centuries into our interstellar age. But we are not naive, and we have never been fools. She leaned forward, and her eyes held Kethvora's with an intensity that was almost painful. We studied your histories before we revealed ourselves to the galaxy, Ambassador, and we learned everything we needed to know about how this civilization works and what happens to species that cannot defend themselves. The Vuthkai, Kethvora whispered, the Dominion, the woman confirmed. Slavers and conquerors who have terrorized this galaxy for 10,000 years, while your precious Concord debated and compromised and accommodated their crimes for the sake of stability. Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath that calm. Something vast and patient and utterly implacable. We always knew this day might come, Ambassador. And so we prepared for it. Kethvora wanted to ask what kind of preparation humanity had made. Wanted to understand what had been hidden beneath the friendly smiles and the cooperative trade agreements. But she found herself afraid to hear the answer. The woman told her anyway. For 3 centuries, we've been building something in the shadows. Something that the galaxy never suspected and will never forget. She stood and walked to the window that looked out on the cold stars. Every colony we established was more than a colony. Every trade agreement we signed carried hidden purposes. Every technology we publicly developed was only a fraction of what we were truly capable of. She turned back to Kethvora, and her smile was the smile of someone who had been keeping a secret for a very long time. You saw what we wanted you to see. Ambassador, a young and harmless species struggling to find its place among ancient powers. But that was never who we really were. Kethvora's voice trembled when she spoke. How many ships do you have? She asked. How many weapons? How many soldiers? The woman did not answer directly. Return to your collective, she said, and tell them what I have told you, and tell the Concord, and tell every species that will listen. And when you are finished, tell the Vuthkai this. She paused, and the silence in that small room felt heavier than the silence that had gripped the galaxy for the past 6 weeks. Tell them that we were never the prey hiding among predators, she said. That we were predators who chose to graze. And now someone has given us a reason to remember what we truly are. She turned and walked toward the door. And Kethvora knew the meeting was over. What are you going to do? She called after the woman, desperate for some answer that might help her understand what was coming. The woman paused at the doorway and looked back over her shoulder. We are going to teach the galaxy a lesson it will never forget, she said. And we are going to start with the Vuthkai Dominion. Then she was gone, and Kethvora sat alone in the empty room, staring at the stars and wondering if she had just witnessed the beginning of the end of everything she had ever known. The silence that had gripped the galaxy was about to break, and she understood now that when it did, the sound would be terrible beyond imagining. The stars go dark. It began at the edges of Vuthkai space. In the distant border systems where patrol ships ran their endless routes and listening, posts watched the darkness between the stars for any sign of threat one by one. They stopped reporting, and at first the Dominion's command centers assumed it was a communication malfunction, some technical glitch that would resolve itself in time. But when they sent ships to investigate, they found nothing waiting for them. The patrol vessels were gone. The listening posts were gone. And there was no debris field. No distress signal, no record of combat, no evidence of what had happened. Ships and installations that had existed for centuries had simply ceased to be. As if they had never existed at all, High Arbiter Zethral received these reports with growing alarm and ordered the full mobilization of the Dominion's war. Fleet's 12 armadas answered his call. totaling more than 40,000 vessels crewed by the finest warriors the HFY had ever produced. These were the ships that had crushed rebellions and conquered empires and brought terror to every corner of the galaxy for 10,000 years. They were the iron fist of the Dominion, and Zethral was certain that no enemy could stand against them. He was wrong. The fleet spread out across Dominion space, hunting for the human forces that must surely be responsible for the disappearing border stations. But they found nothing to fight. Human ships appeared at the very edge of sensor range, like ghosts in the darkness. Always watching, always waiting, but never close enough to engage when the HFY pursued them. The humans retreated into the void when the HFY held position and waited. The humans waited 2 days stretched into weeks, and the great war fleets of the Dominion burned through their supplies while chasing shadows that would not stand and fight. The crews grew nervous. The commanders grew frustrated, and Zethral grew afraid in ways he had never experienced before. He had fought many enemies in his long career, but he had never faced an opponent that refused to be seen, that hid in the darkness and watched and waited for something only they understood. Then the infrastructure began to fail, and Zethral understood that the real war had already been lost before the first shot was fired. Shipyards in the Dominion's core systems went dark as their automated systems crashed, corrupted by code that had been sleeping in their networks for decades. Fuel depots exploded in cascades of fire that lit up entire star systems. Communication satellites broadcast nothing but static, cutting the Dominion's fleets off from their commanders and from each other. The great engines of war that had taken centuries to build crumbled in a matter of days, and there was nothing the HFY could do to stop it. Zethral demanded to know how this was possible, and his terrified technicians delivered an answer that made his blood run cold. Human software had been embedded in Dominion systems since the very first trade agreements between their species, hidden in every transaction and every technology exchange and every diplomatic gift that humanity had ever offered. The code had been dormant for over a century, waiting for the signal to awaken, and now it was tearing the Dominion apart from the inside. Zethral remembered the human ambassador who had smiled and offered friendship, remembered the trade deals that had seemed so profitable, remembered every moment when humanity had appeared weak and harmless and eager to please. It had all been a lie, a mask that hid the patient predator beneath, and he had never suspected a thing. The first human warships emerged from fold space in the HFY home system on the 47th day of silence, and when Zethral saw them on his tactical display, he felt his heart stop beating for a moment that seemed to last forever. There were thousands of them, more ships than any species had ever assembled in one place, and they were massive beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. They looked nothing like the modest patrol vessels and civilian transports that humanity had shown to the galaxy for centuries. These were weapons of war, pure and simple, designed for destruction on a scale that made the Dominion's mightiest dreadnoughts look like children's toys. They did not hail the HFY defenders. They did not demand surrender or issue threats or explain their intentions. They simply began their attack, and the battle that followed was less a war and more an execution. HFY ships fired everything they had, unleashing the weapons that had conquered 1,000 worlds. But the human vessels moved in ways that seemed impossible, dancing through the barrage like they knew where every shot would land before it was fired. Human weapons struck back with energies that the Dominion scientists could not even identify, beams of light that cut through shields like they did not exist, and missiles that seemed to think and adapt and hunt their targets with terrifying intelligence. The first wave of defenders died in minutes. The second wave lasted barely longer. By the time the human fleet reached high orbit over the HFY throne world, there was nothing left to oppose them. but the shattered remnants of what had once been the most powerful military force in the galaxy's Ithral watched from his command bunker, buried beneath a kilometer of hardened stone. And he understood at last what humanity truly was. They had never been the friendly newcomers they pretended to be. They had never been weak or harmless or eager to please. They had been waiting, all along, for someone to give them a reason to show their true face. And now the face had been revealed. And it was the face of a predator that had been sleeping among its prey for centuries. Patient and watchful and always ready for the moment when the hunt would finally begin. The stars above the throne world were filled with human ships, and their silence was more terrible than any battle cry the galaxy had ever heard. The price of silence. The war lasted 19 days. Though calling it a war felt like a cruel joke to everyone who witnessed what humanity did to the Vethkai Dominion. Dominion had held power for 10,000 years, conquering hundreds of species and controlling territory that spanned thousands of light years. But none of that history meant anything against the force that humanity had unleashed. Human weapons operated on principles that they, Dominion's greatest scientists, could not understand, bending space and time in ways that should have been impossible. According to everything the galaxy knew about physics, human ships moved with perfect coordination, thousands of vessels acting as a single mind, anticipating every Vethkai tactic before it could be executed and countering it with devastating precision. Human soldiers, when they finally deployed to the ground, fought with a fury that bordered on the supernatural, moving through enemy positions like water through sand, unstoppable and inevitable. But the most terrifying thing about the human assault was not the technology or the tactics or the overwhelming force. It was the precision, the careful and deliberate nature of every strike, the absolute control that humanity maintained, even in the heat of destruction. The humans did not burn worlds the way the Vethkai had done to countless conquered peoples. They did not massacre civilian populations, or destroy cultural treasures, or salt the earth so nothing would ever grow again. Instead, they moved through Dominion, space like surgeons cutting away a cancer, precise and methodical and horrifyingly efficient. Every member of the Dominion's ruling caste was identified and located, and taken into custody. Every official who had authorized the enslavement of sentient beings was found. No matter how deep they tried to hide, every officer who had commanded a slave ship or overseen a processing facility was tracked down and brought before human tribunals. Every bureaucrat who had stamped the papers that turned living beings into property was held accountable for their crimes. The humans had names and records and evidence going back centuries, documentation that proved they had been watching and preparing for this moment since the very first day they made contact with the galaxy. Nothing had been forgotten, and nothing would be forgiven. High Arbiter Zethral waited in his command bunker as the human forces methodically conquered his throne world, and he had plenty of time to consider the magnitude of his mistake. He had thought humanity was weak because they were young. He had thought they were harmless because they smiled and traded and cooperated with the established powers. He had thought the silence after his conquest of Elysium 7 was the silence of fear and indecision. He had been wrong about everything. When the human Marines finally breached his bunker, cutting through a kilometer of hardened stone like it was paper, Zethral had prepared a speech. He planned to appeal to galactic law and remind the humans that even victors must follow certain rules. He planned to point out that Earth would someday face judgment too, that no power remained supreme forever, that the galaxy had a long memory for atrocities. The soldiers did not give him a chance to speak. They moved in perfect silence, their faces hidden behind featureless helmets, and they fitted him with a neural compliance collar before he could utter a single word. It was the same model that his people had used on the colonists of Elysium 7. the same device that sent threads of control into the brain and ensured perfect obedience through overwhelming pains. Thrall felt the collar activate and understood at last what 2 million humans had experienced at his command. Then he was escorted to a waiting transport, and the last High Arbiter of the Vethkai Dominion disappeared into the silence that had swallowed his empire. 3 months after the crisis began, the silence finally ended. A human diplomat appeared before the Galactic Concord for the first time since the invasion of Elysium 7, and the Great Assembly Hall was more crowded than it had been in centuries. Every species with faster-than-light capability had sent representatives, desperate to understand what had happened and what it meant for the future of the galaxy. The diplomat was the same gray-haired woman who had met with Ambassador Kethvora at the edge of neutral space, and she stood before the assembly with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. "The colonists of Elysium 7 have been freed," she announced, and her voice carried to every corner of the vast chamber. "Their neural collars have been removed, and medical and psychological support has been provided, and they are returning home to rebuild their lives." She paused, and the silence in the chamber was absolute. The Vethkai Dominion has been dissolved, and its territory has been placed under Concord administration until appropriate governance can be established for its remaining population. Another pause, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made several delegates tremble. "The Dominion's leadership has been tried for crimes against sentience, and sentences have been carried out." A murmur ran through the assembly as the implications of that statement sank and the trials had already happened. The sentences had already been executed, and humanity had not asked permission or oversight from anyone. "Earth has a message for this body," the woman continued, and every being in the chamber leaned forward to hear it. "We will not join your concord, and we will not submit to your jurisdiction. But we will trade with you and communicate with you and abide by the laws of neutral space." Her eyes swept across the assembly, meeting the gaze of delegates from 100 different species. "But know this, there is no species in this galaxy beyond our reach, and there is no power we cannot dismantle if we choose to do so, and there is no atrocity we will forgive or forget." She let the words settle into the hearts of everyone listening. Humanity protects its own, today and tomorrow and forever. And it does not matter if the threat is to a colony of millions, or a ship of dozens, or a single citizen standing alone in hostile space. "If you remember nothing else about us," she said, "remember the silence that followed the taking of Elysium 7, and remember what that silence meant. And remember what came after it." The diplomat turned and walked from the chamber without waiting for questions or responses. And behind her the galaxy sat in stunned quiet as a terrible new truth settled into the collective consciousness of every intelligent species. Humanity had never been the harmless newcomer struggling to find its place among ancient powers. Humanity had been the apex predator all along, a hunter so patient and so skilled that it had convinced its prey it was nothing but a grazer. That deception was over now, and the galaxy would never look at the stars the same way again. The silence had broken, but its echo would last forever.